This is Duke University.
Today I'd like to talk to you about the research that I've been doing on the use of stretch goals in organizations and when they can be appropriately and inappropriately used. Why don't we start with the definition? Stretch goals are seemingly impossible goals given current capabilities. So does your organization have the skill, the experience, the resources to be able to achieve a particular goal, or do you actually have absolutely no idea whether it's even possible to achieve it? If you have no idea whether it's possible, that's a stretch goal. There are two key aspects to understanding what a stretch goal is. One is that it's extremely difficult. The second is that it's extremely novel. How much more than what you're currently doing are you shooting for? That defines difficulty. How unfamiliar is the path to achieving it? That defines the novelty. Southwest Airlines has a very famous example where they first instituted the 10-minute turnaround for airplanes in airports. Prior to pursuing a 10-minute turnaround, it was almost an hour that it took to turn around a plane. Tesla recently shortened a 2-year horizon for car production and declared that in the next year it was going to achieve 500,000 cars, and the year after that it was going to achieve 1 million. No idea how to get to those numbers. The idea here is that if you're pursuing a stretch goal, it seems impossible, there's no known path to achieving it, and you are in a situation where you don't necessarily have all the resources needed to achieve it. Let me give you two illustrations from very different spheres about how stretch goals can be used and can be effective. The first comes from the healthcare company DaVita. They decided they really wanted to strive for radical improvement. They created a new division called the Pioneer Division to try out a lot of new ways of doing things. How can we increase our financial efficiency while simultaneously improving patient outcomes and employee satisfaction? The stretch goal for them was, in 4 years, this new unit needed to achieve $60 to $80 million of demonstrable savings while improving patient outcomes and employee satisfaction. In 4 years, they achieved $60 million, and in 5, they achieved $75 million. At the outset, nobody had any idea whether this was even remotely possible. A second example might be a surprising one. It comes from Theodore Geisel, who's more well known as Dr. Seuss. He was given a challenge by a friend of his in publishing to create a book that first graders could not put down. That's not so difficult for someone like Dr. Seuss, except he was given the challenge. He had to only use words from a list of 300 words. He ended up writing a book after 9 months of throwing manuscripts across the room, complaining that this was an impossible task. After 9 months, he came up with a book where he only used 220 different words. You've probably heard of it. It's called The Cat in the Hat. So you might ask yourself, why are stretch goals so popular? You've probably even heard of them. The answer is that there's a real perception that stretch goals lead to big success. We think of examples like General Electric, Google, Amazon, Apple, and other companies that have pursued stretch goals, and it's worked out quite well. So what's the problem? Why would we even need to look more carefully at stretch goals? The answer is they almost always fail to lead to success. The success stories are familiar, but they're actually pretty unusual. It's usually, for most organizations, inappropriate to pursue stretch goals. Pursuing a Hail Mary pass, pursuing what's now referred to as a moonshot, for most organizations does not lead to the outcomes that are so familiar to us. So then the next question is, should we ever use them? My answer is a definitive and enthusiastic yes. We need to pursue great, ambitious targets. We shouldn't ever give up on that. The key is to understand when to pursue them and when not to pursue them. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about next. First, let's quickly analyze When are stretch goals likely to be effective and when are they not likely to be effective? If you look here, you can see that sometimes Slack resources are available in the organization and sometimes they're not so available. Sometimes the organization has had recent performance success and sometimes it's had recent performance failure. This is very important to understand. Which quadrant are you in your organization if you're to know whether stretch goals are likely to be effective for you or not? You can see when you have high recent success and you have a lot of resources, stretch goals are a terrific thing for you. Your organization is thriving and you're in a great position to successfully pursue stretch goals. Take the opposite quadrant. When you have low resources and you've had recent failures, you are really struggling. This is not the time to pursue stretch goals. If you look at the off quadrants, it's a little more mixed. Those are more neutral to positive if you're in the lower right quadrant, neutral to negative if you're in the upper left quadrant. If your resources are constrained, stretch goals probably aren't going to work so well for you. You're going to be okay, but you probably should not pursue them. If you're in the lower right quadrant, you're capable of maybe pursuing stretch goals a little bit, but because you're coming off recent performance failures, you may not have the momentum, the positive experience to be able to successfully pursue a stretch goal. So in those off quadrants, you should be cautious. Now let's take the analysis one step further. And this may be a little surprising, and this is a very important aspect of it. Who tends to use stretch goals? The organizations that are most likely to use stretch goals are in the lower left quadrant. They're grasping at that moonshot. They're grasping for that Hail Mary. They're in a situation where they don't have Slack resources, but because they've experienced recent failure, they're going to go for broke. They're really going to try for it. On the other hand, if you look in the upper right quadrant, where you have lots of resources, lots of recent success, what happens to those organizations? They tend to get complacent. They sit back, they become risk averse, and they become very conservative. They're the least likely to pursue a stretch goal. If you go to the off quadrants, again, it's a mixed message. You may have the capability, but you're a little discouraged. Or you may have some confidence, but you're a little constrained by resources. In those cases, there's a mixed message about how often you'll pursue them. What's interesting is if you compare this chart with the previous chart, what it shows is that those who are most likely to succeed are the least likely to pursue stretch goals. Those that are the least likely to succeed are the most likely to pursue stretch goals. This is what we refer to as the paradox of stretch goals. So the key takeaway from that is if you have recent success and adequate resources, that's the time you should try for these really radical innovations, these stretch goals. If you're coming off a recent failure and you're choosing to go for broke because, well, why not? That is exactly the time you should not go for stretch goals. But what about those off-diagonal cells? What are your alternatives? What is available to you as an alternative path besides either going for stretch goals or just saying we're not going to go for them at all? Well, there are alternatives. There are three in particular that we talk about. One underlies all of these. One is if you don't have adequate resources, build up your resources. Build up those Slack resources. Do a lot of things to try to make yourself better positioned to pursue more ambitious goals. But then there are two specific strategies that are an alternative to stretch goals. One is pursuing small wins. If you look at this table, you can see when your Slack resources are low, what you want to do is you don't want to give up. What you want to do is look for those small incremental wins because they have two payoffs. One is by winning, you're building your resources. The second is by winning, even if they're really small wins, by winning, you're also building your confidence, your momentum, and your experience. So you may be able in the future to go for that stretch goal, or you can just, by taking these smaller steps, accumulate tremendous success over time. There is yet another alternative path that you can take, and that's called small losses. This is where you undertake experiments. They may be a little risky. You know that 9 out of 10 of them may not succeed, but because they're small, it's not a big risk. It's not a big problem if they don't work out well. And in fact, you can learn a lot. This is the basis for experimentation in general. You try a lot of different little things, you learn from each of them, and eventually you figure out what is the right path to take. So instead of just pursuing stretch, which only works in that top right quadrant, what you want to do is to pursue small wins or small losses when you've done a proper analysis of which condition your organization is in. So what is the takeaway from this? After looking at lots and lots of organizations and much research, the bottom line is, yes, you should go for moonshots. Yes, you should really try to pursue stretch goals, but only when the conditions are right. When your natural tendency is to be conservative and to say, why should we take that risk? We're doing just great. That's exactly when you can make a difference. You can land the next person on the moon. You can build the next Panama Canal. You can create the next iPhone. You can radically transform your industry or even our society in positive ways when you know you're in the right situation. Don't sit back. Don't become conservative. Our world needs people and organizations to take stretch goal risks. However, what we do not need is that to be done naively. When you're in circumstances where you haven't had recent successes, when you don't have adequate resources, there are alternative strategic paths you can take rather than going for broke and shooting for that moonshot. The key here is if you do a proper analysis and you really understand your situation, you can pursue stretch goals in a smart way and you can pursue alternatives in a smart way as well.